Welcome back to Flagstone Trail. We're doing a deep dive into Robert Greene's 48 Laws of Power, and today we're going to be looking at one that I think we can all relate to, especially in the modern workplace. Law 9. Win through your actions, never through argument.
Yeah, it's a fascinating law, isn't it? It really gets to the heart of how influence works, in both professional and personal lives.
So let's break down the core concept here. Law 9 suggests that arguing even if you win often creates more problems than it solves.
Exactly right. You might score points in the moment, but you risk damaging relationships, bruising egos, and ultimately undermining your own influence.
And to illustrate this point, Greene shares a pretty dramatic story about a Roman consul named Mucianus. This guy, he was leading a siege on a Greek town, and he needed a battering ram, a big one, to break down the walls.
Right. Enter the Athenian engineer, brilliant guy, expert in his field. He's ordered to send the largest ship mast he can find. Perfect for a battering ram, right?
Not so fast.
Yeah.
This engineer, he was convinced that a smaller mast was actually the better choice. He truly believed it'd be more effective and easier to transport. But here's where things get interesting. Instead of simply sending the smaller mast and letting the results speak for themselves, he felt the need to argue his point, with the soldiers carrying out the consul's order.
Right. He insisted on explaining his logic, drawing diagrams, even telling the soldiers that they didn't know what they were talking about. Not exactly the best way to win over the people who report directly to the consul.
And they warned him, right? They said something like, hey, our boss Mucianus, he's not exactly the type to appreciate being questioned.
Right. But the engineer, blinded by his own brilliance, continued to argue, convinced that reason would prevail. Against his better judgment, he sent the smaller mast thinking, surely the consul will see how much better this is.
But Mucianus was already on edge from the siege. When the smaller mast arrived, he saw it as a direct challenge to his authority. He was furious.
Yeah. And in a truly brutal display of power, Mucianus had the engineer stripped naked, publicly flogged, and beaten to death.
Wow. Talk about a cautionary tale. I think what's really fascinating here is that this story isn't just about one stubborn engineer. It's a reflection of a type of person we encounter all too often. Someone who gets so caught up in being right that they lose sight of the bigger picture.
Right. Greene calls them the arguer. They believe that logic should always win the day, and they fail to grasp the nuances of social dynamics, especially when dealing with those in positions of power.
So what's the takeaway for us? I mean, we've all been in situations where we felt the urge to argue our point, to prove that we're right. But this story highlights the danger of that approach, especially when power dynamics are at play.
It's a reminder that sometimes the most effective way to influence others is not through forceful words, but through strategic action.
Instead of getting trapped in verbal sparring, Law 9 encourages us to find more subtle ways to make our point.
Show, don't tell. Let your actions and their positive outcomes speak for themselves.
And to showcase this in action, Greene offers a brilliant counterpoint to the engineer's tragic tale. This time we're in Florence, in the early 1500s, and the subject is a magnificent block of marble intended for a grand sculpture.
Ah, yes, the story of Michelangelo and the David. This block of marble had been deemed ruined by a previous sculptor, who had made a critical error.
So it was just sitting there, gathering dust, until some of Michelangelo's friends thought, hey, maybe Michelangelo could do something with this. They knew he had a unique vision, an ability to see possibility where others saw only failure.
And they were right. Michelangelo believed he could salvage it. He envisioned the statue of David, but he had to adapt the pose to accommodate the damage to the marble.
But Florence's mayor, a man named Soderini, wasn't convinced. He saw it as a lost cause.
Soderini was a practical man, maybe a little skeptical, but eventually he agreed to give Michelangelo a chance.
Weeks later, Michelangelo was putting the finishing touches on his masterpiece. Soderini, always eager to offer his opinion, inspected the nearly finished statue. He circles it, strokes his chin, and declares, it's magnificent, but...
There's always a but, isn't there?
And Soderini's but was the statue's nose. He thought it was too big.
Oh, the nose.
Imagine the tension in that room. Michelangelo, I bet, wanted to argue to defend his artistic vision. He was Michelangelo, after all. But he also understood the dynamics of power. A direct confrontation with Soderini would likely be a losing battle.
He knew that Soderini, like many patrons of the arts, took pride in his own judgment. To argue would be to challenge that pride and potentially risk losing future support.
So instead of arguing, Michelangelo did something incredibly clever. He invited Soderini to join him on the scaffolding. bringing him closer to the statue's face. And here's where the magic happens. Michelangelo picks up his chisel and some marble dust and pretends to work on the nose. Tapping lightly, letting the dust fall strategically, he wasn't actually changing anything, just creating the illusion of making adjustments.
Oh, wow.
And after a few minutes of this performance, he steps back and says, "Take another look." Soderini, completely taken in, declares, "Much better. You've brought it to life."
A perfect example of winning through action, not argument. Michelangelo preserved his artistic integrity, Soderini felt validated, and the David remained untouched, a masterpiece for the ages.
Nobody's ego is bruised, and Michelangelo makes his point without a single word of argument. This, I think, is the essence of Law 9. It's about understanding that often the most effective way to persuade is not through forceful words, but through skillful action.
It's about finding ways to demonstrate your point, to allow others to experience the validity of your ideas rather than simply trying to convince them with words. And as we see with Michelangelo, it often requires a touch of creativity, thinking outside the box.
Now let's shift gears and think about how we can apply this principle in the modern workplace. Imagine you're in a meeting and you have a strong conviction about the direction of a project. You could engage in a heated debate. Try to win over your colleagues with logic and data.
But what if, instead of arguing, you prepare a compelling presentation showcasing the potential benefits of your proposed direction? Back it up with solid research. You're not arguing, you're demonstrating. You're letting the evidence speak for itself.
Right. Or let's say you're trying to suggest a new, more efficient process to your team.
Instead of simply proposing it, why not pilot the process in a small, controlled setting? Let the positive results, the increased efficiency, be the proof that wins people over.
I love that. It's about taking action to demonstrate the value of your ideas rather than getting bogged down in debates that might create resistance.
Exactly. And sometimes the most powerful move is to walk away, to choose strategic silence. Green points this out as well.
So it's about knowing when not to engage.
Precisely. If the issue is trivial, or if time will ultimately prove your point, disengaging can be far more powerful than getting caught in a war of words.
It's about choosing your battles wisely and recognizing that sometimes letting things unfold naturally allows others to come to their own conclusions through experience.
And that's true not just in the workplace, but in our personal lives as well. Think about conflict resolution in a relationship. We've all been there. A heated argument erupts. Nothing gets resolved.
Instead of trying to win the argument, to force your partner to see things your way, what if you focused on demonstrating understanding and empathy?
Actions like active listening, offering a sincere apology, or simply taking some space to cool down can speak volumes.
It's about shifting the focus from winning to understanding, from proving your point to demonstrating your care.
And sometimes, actions as simple as doing a chore without being asked, offering a thoughtful gift, or planning a special evening can be far more persuasive than any words could ever be.
It's amazing how often we try to argue our way into getting what we want, when a shift to action could be so much more effective.
And this idea of demonstration goes beyond concrete actions. It can extend to the use of symbols, which Green suggests can be even more potent than direct action.
Symbols. Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
Think about it. Symbols tap into shared emotions and bypass the need for lengthy explanations. They carry a weight of meaning that transcends words. Remember the story about Henry Kissinger's visit to Masada during negotiations with Israel?
Yes, he visited the ruins of that ancient fortress where Jewish warriors chose mass suicide over surrender to the Romans.
Exactly. Kissinger never explicitly accused the Israelis of being inflexible or courting disaster. But his actions, his choice to visit that particular site at that crucial moment, spoke volumes. It was a nonverbal message that resonated deeply, prompting reflection far more effectively than any direct argument could have.
Wow, so it's about understanding the power of imagery, of actions that carry symbolic weight. That's a whole new level of strategic thinking.
It is, yeah. It's about recognizing that sometimes the most effective communication isn't about what we say, but about what we do, and the deeper meaning those actions convey.
This is reminding me of a concept I came across recently called soft power. Have you heard of it?
Oh, absolutely. It's a fascinating idea, you know. It's about influencing through attraction rather than coercion, through culture and values rather than force.
Exactly. And I think Law 9 is very much aligned with that concept. It's about winning people over, not by forcing them to submit to our will, but by making them want to follow our lead.
It's about cultivating influence through actions that inspire trust, respect, and admiration.
And that often means setting aside our ego, our need to be right, and focusing on the bigger picture, on the long-term impact of our choices. Which brings us back to the idea of self-awareness.
Yeah, you're right. Mastering Law 9 requires a high degree of self-awareness. Because if we're constantly trying to win every argument, prove every point through words, we're likely missing opportunities for more subtle and effective influence.
We need to be honest with ourselves about our motivations. Are we truly arguing for the sake of a better outcome? Or are we simply feeding our ego?
A great question to ask ourselves. And I think it ties back to the idea of mastering our emotions, which is so crucial for wielding power effectively.
Right, because when emotions like anger or pride are driving our actions, we're less likely to make strategic choices. Think about that Athenian engineer. He was so convinced of his intellectual superiority that he failed to consider the emotional impact of his arguments on Mucianus.
He let his desire to be right, to prove his expertise, cloud his judgment, and it ultimately cost him his life. Harsh lesson indeed.
It really highlights the importance of emotional intelligence in the game of power. Being able to read the room, assess the emotional landscape, is just as crucial as having brilliant ideas.
Absolutely. Logic and reason aren't always the most persuasive tools. Sometimes appealing to emotions, even subtly, can be far more effective. And that's where the power of symbols comes into play again. Symbols are inherently emotional, they bypass the logical mind, and tap into deeper feelings and associations.
Like Kissinger's visit to Masada. It wasn't a logical argument. It was a symbolic gesture that evoked a powerful emotional response.
Precisely. And that's why mastering Law 9 requires us to become more attuned to the symbolic meaning of our actions.
So it's not just about what we do, but also about how we do it and the message that conveys.
Exactly. Think about it in the context of leadership. A leader who micromanages every detail might be trying to demonstrate competence and control, but what message does that send?
It can actually send the opposite message, right? Like a lack of trust in the team's abilities.
Exactly. It undermines their authority rather than reinforcing it. Whereas a leader who delegates effectively and empowers their team might seem to be giving up control on the surface.
But they're conveying trust and confidence in their team's abilities, which ultimately strengthens their leadership.
Precisely. It's about understanding these subtle layers of communication that go beyond words. Now let's brainstorm some real-life situations where Law 9 can make all the difference. Imagine you're trying to convince your boss to adopt a new strategy.
Instead of launching into a big argument, maybe I could gather some data, run a pilot program, and present the results in a way that highlights the benefits of the new strategy.
That's a great example. You're not just talking about it, you're demonstrating its effectiveness. Or imagine you have a colleague who's resistant to change. They're clinging to an old process that's no longer efficient.
Instead of arguing about it, I could offer to help them transition to the new process, show them how it works, highlight the benefits they'll experience personally.
Exactly. You're meeting them where they are, addressing their concerns through action rather than words.
It's interesting how shifting to action can often disarm people. It takes the focus off of winning or losing and puts it on achieving a shared goal.
And I think that's a key insight here. Law 9 isn't about manipulating people or getting your way at all costs. It's about finding a more effective and often more harmonious way to achieve your goals.
It's about recognizing that actions often speak a language that words simply can't match, a language of credibility, competence, and ultimately influence.
Yeah, it really is about shifting our mindset, isn't it? From seeing persuasion as a battle of words to understanding it as a demonstration of value.
That's a great way to put it. Law 9 invites us to become more conscious of how our actions are perceived, to think about the messages we're sending beyond the words we speak.
It's like that famous quote by Ralph Waldo Emerson, "What you do speaks so loudly that I cannot hear what you say."
A perfect encapsulation of this law. In the realm of power and influence, our actions are the ultimate testament to our character, our beliefs, and our intentions. They're the language that truly resonates.
Makes me think about leaders who inspire trust and respect. It's not just what they say, it's what they do. It's their consistency, their fairness, their willingness to roll up their sleeves and work alongside their team.
Exactly. Those actions build a foundation of credibility that no amount of eloquent speeches can replicate. It's not about wielding power over people, but cultivating a kind of magnetic force that draws people to you.
Precisely. And that's why Law 9 is so much more than just a clever tactic. It's a philosophy of leadership, a way of approaching the world that prioritizes action over empty words.
It's about understanding that true power lies not in commanding or controlling, but in inspiring, in motivating others to embrace your vision.
And doing so by showing them the path forward through your own actions rather than just telling them what to do.
Which requires a certain level of self-belief, right? Conviction in your own ideas. If you're not confident in your vision, how can you expect others to follow?
Absolutely. It's about having the courage to act on your convictions, to demonstrate your commitment through tangible results. Let your actions speak for themselves.
As we've been talking, I've been thinking about times when I've tried to argue my way into getting what I wanted, but I'm realizing now that a shift to action might have been far more effective.
Yeah, I think we've all been there. It's easy to fall into the trap of thinking that if we can just articulate our point clearly enough, we'll win people over. But this law reminds us that sometimes the most powerful arguments are the ones we never make.
It's about letting our actions do the talking, demonstrating our value through concrete results.
And that's true whether we're trying to influence a colleague, a client, a loved one, or even ourselves. Action is the catalyst for change, the engine that propels us forward.
This has been such an eye-opening discussion. I'm already feeling inspired to approach situations differently, to prioritize action over argument.
It's a powerful shift in perspective. And remember, the beauty of this law is that it applies to all areas of life. Whether we're aiming for professional success, navigating personal relationships, or simply trying to become better versions of ourselves, action is the key that unlocks our potential.
So, as we wrap up our deep dive into Law 9, we encourage you to consider, what's one action you're going to take this week to embody this principle? What's one area where you can demonstrate your value, your commitment, or your vision through action rather than words? Keep those wheels turning.
And that's it for today's Flagstone Trail discussion. We appreciate your listenership.